Yes, I can. Shall I go ahead? Brilliant. Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Grace, and well done for answering the paradigms question in your talk. So sorry for not being able to join in person, which is really disappointing for me. Circumstances didn't allow this time. But huge thanks for the organising committee for accommodating all us virtual delegates. I know it can be a pain in the arse sometimes, so I know it can't be easy, so really appreciate it. So, in the spirit of healthy debate and internal critique within a community of practice, this paper tackles head-on the paradigms narrative in qualitative research. So despite the potential for some polite disagreement, I hope that I'm taking a kind of respectful tone today, while also being appropriately provocative, but I'm certainly learning in this regard, so do bear with us. However, it's my view that continuing the conversation on the topic like paradigms in philosophy is really important, because I think there's really a lot of anxiety about this stuff. I think this can come from a lot of confusion. Of course, confusion can be usually disclosed in private or when people have their guard down, which can sometimes be in stark contrast to when people confidently perform their repertoires about paradigms in writing or maybe while talking to junior colleagues or students. So maybe the level of literacy around philosophy of science in our field is maybe not as good as it could be, not one of our strong points perhaps. And maybe this is good for any scientific community, not least because it can sometimes feel like you're somewhere in the Emperor's New Clothes story. So what is the paradigms narrative then? So boiled down to a clear sentence, I think the paradigms narrative says that the practice of qualitative research is underpinned by a distinctive set of paradigmatic assumptions held by the researcher. Versions of this statement are evident all around the place, but let's start with a clip from an excellent podcast which brought qualitative experts together and defined qualitative methods like this. I really hope you can hear this. I've no way of knowing, so it'd just be really awkward if you can't.
And so I think kind of a nice way to describe it is that qualitative research, really refers to a family of methodologies that focuses on understanding like meaning and interpretation of experience. And it has distinct epistemological and ontological assumptions, which is kind of like the idea of what knowledge and reality are and how they can be understood. So from a quantitative lens, quantitative research is really founded on this idea that there is one single objective reality or truth that can be observed or measured. And qualitative really takes, a different stance on that.
So something similar is said in methods textbooks like this, and I won't say which textbook because it's about the words here and not the authors. But it says quantitative and qualitative research have different assumptions which are translated into different types of data. And similarly in this paper here, these arguments were put forward because qualitative research is informed by ontological and epistemological assumptions, logics and goals that are different to quantitative research informed by post-positivism or neo-realism. So much of this is what I call exceptionalism or distinctiveness for qualitative research, and I see this as exaggerated or false exceptionalism. But not only are paradigms about exceptionalism and distinctiveness in terms of ontology and epistemology, but for these leading authors, these assumptions are about being held by the researcher. So it's researcher-centric, so a lack of concern with one's own epistemology and ontology. And here it's about the researcher's standpoint, it's about the researcher's proposed relationship, what the researcher counts as knowledge, etc. So it's researcher-centric too. And the significance of this is that you can position yourself within a particular paradigm, often presented in tables like this, where you can vertically look across three different paradigms here, and horizontally you can read into the ontology, epistemology, nature of knowledge, methodology, and goodness of quality criteria. So there are three paradigms here, and in this other version there are 6 different paradigms. And what you can do then is be internally coherent within each of those vertical columns and pick up different versions of truth, reality, rigour, generalisability, and so on. So this paper is to explore, the paradigms narrative insists on the characteristics of distinctiveness from quantitative research in ontological and epistemological terms, researcher centricity, and coherence within the researcher's chosen paradigm. So the aim of this paper is to explore the universal negative proposition that the practice of qualitative research is not underpinned by a distinctive set of paradigmatic assumptions held by the researcher. So for those who come across as very confident about philosophical assumptions and talk about this paradigm story, what I'm doing here is channeling Daniel Kahneman, who says that the confidence people have in their beliefs is not a measure of the quality of evidence, but the coherence of the story the mind has managed to construct. So I think there are three reasons that I'm presenting today to think that the paradigms narrative might be mistaken. So I'm thinking of these as red flags or holes in the argument. 1. The practitioner's quandary. So as a little thought experiment, imagine a practitioner who needs some research done. In this case, the head of a national governing body who is creating a new policy about the simple task of coming up with a policy about trans women competing in the female category in a particular sport. So he provides funding for 2 research teams to better understand the situation. One team happens to be a team of researchers apparently working in the post-positivist paradigm, and the other in the interpretivist paradigm. Both use best practice and quality criteria according to their own paradigm, but arrive at different and incompatible findings. The post-positivists were looking for an objective reality and claim to have measured and observed more or less conclusively that trans women do not have an unfair advantage over women assigned female at birth. The interpretists, on the other hand, rejected the idea of an objective reality in the first place, highlighted that fairness is a relative concept, and completely rejected the idea that the study could be more or less conclusive. So, who should the head of the national governing body listen to? They cannot both be right at the same time, just as Schrodinger's cat cannot be both dead and alive. This is not satisfactory for the practitioners, in my view. And to me, the key point here is that when framed in a scenario like this, we are reminded that the paradigms narrative is a construction of the academic world. The real world perhaps does not care what paradigm we are operating in. 2. The fragility of researcher centricity. So one aspect of the paradigms narrative is that paradigmatic assumptions are beliefs held by the researcher, and in my view this is quite different to Thomas Kuhn's conceptualization of paradigms. This sounds to me more like the manifestation of a contemporary libertarian "you do you" mantra, as Jason Mraz sings in this catchy pop song chorus. You do you, and I'll do me. Together we'll make harmony. Together we may dance differently, but it's all good. So I think Jason Mraz would be keen on the paradigms narrative. So the mantra can be followed fairly easily in your own PhD on a clearly defined area of inquiry, where you state your own paradigm, pick the methods that match, and the appropriate rigor criteria, and so on. However, after that it gets challenged quite quickly and reveals it is surprisingly much less stable and more fragile than originally thought. So what if you're a positivist when it comes to material things, like the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccine, so you get your positivist tattoo, but when it comes to the morality of state-enforced vaccination programs, you might disagree and change your mind and you become a constructivist. So switching like this undermines the notion of a researcher-centred paradigmatic assumptions, certainly in a stable sense. Indeed, how is this supposed to work as part of a team of authors on one paper who normally declare themselves as to operating in different paradigms? Do you state everyone's own paradigmatic position or pick a single one for the paper to appear coherent? And what about making sense of studies from diverse paradigms, like in literature reviews or research syntheses? If you are able to amalgamate or make sense of these under one umbrella paradigm, then you have by definition violated the author's original stated paradigm. 3. Pineapple on pizza. So a key part of the paradigms narrative is coherence, or perhaps performative coherence, which offers a kind of aesthetic harmony. There are some things that feel like they shouldn't go together, like pineapple on pizza. I'm more in favour of Argyle from Stranger Things, who thinks that sometimes these things actually do go well.
Oh, fruit on your pizza's gnarly, you say? Well, I say try before you deny. Hello?
So, performative coherence in the paradigm narrative, kind of like a tree metaphor, says that ontology logically foregrounds epistemology, which in turn logically foregrounds method. So we have a different tree here with different assumptions leading to different methods. This is a simplified version, obviously. This sometimes can be hard incommensurability and determinism, with some saying that realist ontologies, for example, if you wanted to go across like that, do not go with constructivist epistemologies. So if you wanted to go across, you might come across the objection that realist ontologies held by the researcher contradicts the constructionist epistemology they hold. They cannot have it both ways. Other times this is presented more softly as an association. So different types of measurement are simply associated with positivism and interpretivism. But either way, there is certainly some leaning towards sticking with your own tree. While I can see how this aesthetic harmony makes sense if you buy into the metaphor, I think there might be some concrete examples that problematize it. For example, if you have an argument about the shape of the planet with someone who believes that the Earth is probably flat, you're both assuming a realist ontology. If you're having an argument, there is an objective state of affairs that just exists independently of human thought. If you think that we are certain that we know the Earth is spherical, then you are being an epistemological objectivist. Whereas the flat earther says we should be more open to other interpretations, observations are manipulated, and they are constructed by power relations from the government, then they are being an epistemological constructivist. So while it's helpful to think in these terms, epistemologies are not necessitated by ontologies. Then, on the link between epistemology and method, higher up the tree, you can quantitatively study some things in sport too. So think about the gender inequalities in tennis. You can quantitatively study pay differences, ticket sales, website clicks, to evidence that women's tennis gets a rough deal. But a right-wing newspaper, the tabloid newspaper, could still choose to be highly interpretivist with these numbers, as well as express scepticism about the methods and the feminist motivations of the data collection in the first place. So doing this would be quantitative and constructivism going together. In contrast, you could use a qualitative sensibility to notice that male and female tennis players are presented differently in the media. That's not hard to imagine, being incredibly confident or even certain that this is a fact, objectively true, and no one can deny it. This would be being objectivist about qualitative data. So the key point here is that if it is intuitively unproblematic to mix and match across ontology, epistemology, and method with these simple concrete examples I've just given, it's peculiar that this mixing and matching is presented as being problematic in the Paradigms narrative. So the argument about this intuitive concrete examples here is basically this. So if the Paradigms narrative insists necessarily on the characteristics of distinctiveness, researcher-centeredness, and coherence, and we intuitively experience coherence about concrete examples to the contrary, then either the Paradigms narrative is false or our intuitions are mistaken. So this is not the final word, of course, and I would welcome people pointing out my mistakes in these premises, but not only is there a tightening of the argument needed as I write this up into a paper, but also I suggest there's need for some empirical studies, drawing on social epistemology to investigate how, why, and what circumstances the Paradigms narrative comes to be understood and endorsed. Is it perhaps protectionist paradigmatic behaviour like Weed suggested, or some kind of strategic playing the game? Might it be that paradigmatic descriptions are like signs of the zodiac, ambiguous enough to see in them what you want to see? Or are we all yearning for a researcher identity so much that we exaggerate our small differences? In this, there's a certain level of vanity and narcissism within ourselves for which we ought to seriously reflect on. Nevertheless, going against the Paradigms narrative and undoing methodology is no small task. So even if what I've said here is true, and it's a big if, maybe the critique is too late. So closing with Jonathan Swift, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it, so that when people come to be undeceived, it's too late. The jest is over and the tale has had its effect. Thank you.